On May 1st, 1933, the American government told its citizens one thing: turn in your gold. They had 30 days to turn in their gold. Americans who turned in their gold that day received $20.67 per troy ounce. But 9 months later, the government raised the value of that same gold to $35. The government made a profit of $2.8 billion overnight, not over 10 years, not through a policy change, overnight. While the ink on the Gold Reserve Act was still wet, Roosevelt signed Presidential Proclamation 2072 in Washington. This is not a controversial issue. It's written in the Federal Reserve's own archives. But not everything in those archives is told. Because most Americans never surrendered their gold, not because they were rebels, not because they were particularly clever, because the ban was on paper, not on the streets. The government created the threat, but it never built the infrastructure needed to enforce that threat. The Treasury's own figures reveal how vast this gap was. So the real question isn't the profit the government made, it's who deliberately exploited this gap in the system. And what happened to those who trusted the system and lost? Before the decree was signed, the situation in America was as follows. The banks had already collapsed, not figuratively, but literally. Because since 1929, people had lost trust in their banks. When everyone tried to withdraw their money at the same time, the banks couldn't hold up. On February 14, 1933, bank runs in Michigan were about to consume every institution. The governor declared a statewide bank holiday. Within weeks, governors across the country followed suit. By March 4th, the day Roosevelt was sworn in, America's monetary system had effectively ground to a halt. When Franklin Roosevelt took the stage, two crises were unfolding simultaneously. First, 1 in 4 people was unemployed. Second, the Federal Reserve's vault should have contained gold. This gold was the guarantee for the money in circulation. The rule was that at least 40% of the reserves had to be gold. On that day, there was only 24%. In other words, the system had already collapsed according to its own rules. This was stated by one of the top figures within the system, George Harrison, in his own words. Roosevelt didn't sit down in his chair before the fire started, but while everything was burning. The only thing he could do was prevent further damage. There was no turning back. He just had to stop the fire. And he had only one tool at his disposal. It was a law written in 1917 during the war to prevent American companies from doing business with enemy countries. Roosevelt took it, and in peacetime, he applied it to his own citizens. On April 5, 1933, the bank holiday was still in effect. While Americans were wondering when the banks would reopen and what had happened to their money, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The order was short, but until that day, Americans' only concern was their money. After that day, it was also their gold. The order required them to deposit their gold in a Federal Reserve Bank by May 1st. In return, they would receive paper money at $20.67 per troy ounce. The penalty for non-compliance? A $10,000 fine, about $230,000 in today's money, or 10 years in federal prison. Both penalties could be imposed. The next morning, the New York Times published the full text of the decree. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York distributed Circular Number 1204 to every banking institution in its district. Take delivery of your customers' gold. Report unusual activity. Cooperate with Treasury agents. This is the version most people know, and most people stop there. The government ordered, citizens obeyed, the metal changed hands, the story ended. But that's not what the documents show. The government had done the math before signing the decree. They estimated that Americans had about $1.4 billion worth of gold. The decree was issued. Newspapers wrote about it. Banks issued warnings. Federal agents got involved. And when the deadline of May 1st arrived, the gold collected was between $300 million and $500 million. There is no exact figure, the records are unclear, but all estimates point to the same thing. Despite penalties and warnings, the government was only able to collect at most 1/3 of what it had expected. Two sources calculated the ratio of gold that was delivered and not delivered: the Treasury itself and the 1963 study by Milton, Friedman, and Anna Schwartz. The figures differ, but both arrive at the same conclusion. The vast majority of Americans did not surrender their gold. The gold did not flee abroad. It was not buried in the ground. It remained at home. The federal government's decision was clear. The penalties were severe. But why, despite this, did the public not surrender their gold? How is this possible? The answer lies within the decree itself. Some loopholes were left in the decree when it was written. Whether intentionally or unintentionally is debatable. But those loopholes existed, and two people saw them differently. One would lose everything, the other would lose nothing. The story of these two people will show us how the decree worked, and how it didn't work. The first person is Frederick Barber Campbell, a Harvard graduate, a Manhattan lawyer, a man who knew the law well enough to understand when it was being used against him, but didn't know when to stop. Late 1932, early 1933, the decree had not yet been signed. Campbell deposited his gold bars at Chase National Bank. 27 bars, approximately 5,000 troy ounces, worth about $135,000 at the time. When the decree came out, Campbell asked the bank for his gold back. One of the country's largest banks could not ignore the federal government's decision and return the gold to a citizen. And the bank did not give him the gold. Campbell sued the bank. This decision changed everything. Suing made him visible, and in 1933, being visible was the biggest risk. On September 27, 1933, reported in Time magazine under the headline, "Gold Indictment Number 1, a federal grand jury indicted Campbell for failing to register his gold holdings. He scored a minor technical victory in court. The decree had been signed by the wrong person, the president instead of the Treasury secretary. For a moment, he could have won. The appeals court rejected this argument. The prosecution continued. The gold was confiscated and melted down. Campbell received $20.67 per ounce. The physical metal never returned. Campbell's story is not a textbook. It is a historical record. The government could not go after millions of people. There were no resources, no infrastructure. But it could have set an example. It could have chosen a deterrent target. Campbell was a perfect target. His gold was registered at the bank. He had made himself known by filing a lawsuit. His name had appeared in the newspapers. All the government had to do was open that file. That's why Campbell's story is still being told today. It's not the story of those who challenge the system, but of those who get stuck within it. The second person was a financier living in Baltimore. Louis E. Eliasberg Sr. was neither a gambler nor a rebel. He was a man who read documents line by line, then acted according to what he read. When the decree was published in the New York Times, Eliasberg, like everyone else, read the headlines first. But then he found the original decree and read it in its entirety. And he found 4 words that the newspapers had not highlighted: rare and unusual coins. The decree had included an exception within itself when it imposed the gold ban. Rare coins in the hands of collectors were not considered monetary gold. They were property. They were collectibles. They did not have to be surrendered. Eliasberg did not flee, hide, or bury anything. He went to coin dealers. While the ban was in effect, while federal agents were melting down collected gold, while Campbell was fighting in court, Eliasberg continued to buy. He acquired rare gold coins through a dealer named B. Max Mell. He registered each one as a collector's item, not as money, not as monetary gold, as collector's property. The coins Eliasberg purchased during that period still exist. The records are still intact. The dealer's ledgers are still legible. When the ban was lifted, Eliasberg's collection was the most complete collection of American coins in history. This is not a guess, it is a documented fact. And Eliasberg never hid. Everyone could see what he was doing, but no one stopped him. Because what he was doing was legal. The government had made no mistake. The decree deliberately made this distinction. Gold held as currency was one thing, gold held as a collection was another. And the decree was written by people who understood this difference. Eliasberg didn't beat the system. He found the boundary the system itself had drawn, and he stayed on the right side of that boundary, during the ban and after it was lifted. Campbell and Eliasberg are not symbols. They are real people whose names appear in court records and archives. But patterns emerging from their stories appear repeatedly in the 1933 record. The first pattern, visibility, was the greatest risk. The gold seized in 1933 was almost always gold held within the banking system. It was registered, it was reported, it was tied to an account. The government did not go door to door. It took what it could see. Campbell's gold was at Chase. It could not have been in a more obvious location. Second pattern. It was not where the gold was, but how it was defined that mattered. The numismatic exemption was not an error. Congress and the Treasury knew coin collecting was a legitimate activity. People collected gold coins not as currency, but for their historical and cultural value. And they wrote this distinction into the decree. Those who documented their gold as collection items before April 1933 were in a different legal category. The determining factor was not the vault door. It was the purchase receipt. Third pattern. Enforcement did not cover everyone. The Justice Department prosecuted only a small number of cases. The records do not show door-to-door searches. What they show is this. The government went after visible, registered, and resistant individuals. Those who remained silent, did not file lawsuits, did not come to the bank with their gold bars and say, "Give it back," were largely left alone. On January 30th, 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. And the next day, he signed something else. The official price of gold changed from $20.67 to $35. The system hadn't malfunctioned. It had worked exactly as planned. The transfer of wealth from private citizens to the Treasury was not a side effect. It was the policy itself. The Treasury earned an estimated $2.8 billion from this difference. With this money, Roosevelt gained direct control over the dollar without needing congressional approval. Every citizen who complied with the decree lost 41% of their gold in 275 days. The Federal Reserve's own records say so. Private gold ownership was banned in the United States for 41 years. On December 31st, 1974, President Gerald Ford signed an executive order. Roosevelt's restrictions imposed in 1933 were officially lifted that day. Congress also passed a law during the same period restoring citizens' right to own gold. The ban did not end with a major investigation. No one was held accountable for the transfer of $2.8 billion in wealth. It ended quietly, on the last day of the year, amid routine legal proceedings. Campbell's 27 gold bars were melted down in 1933, 5,000 ounces, $135,000. Not a single record remains of what physically happened to it. The metal was gone. The lawsuit remained. The gold was gone. Eliasberg continued to buy throughout the ban. When the ban was lifted, he had the most complete collection of American coins in history. The 1933 double eagle coins he acquired during the ban years are among the most valuable American coins in existence today. Those coins still exist. They can still be seen. They can still be sold. Same year, same decree, two different endings. Decree number 6102 is often told as a story of government power. And that is true. The power was real. The penalties were real. A man's 5,000 ounces of gold were melted down and never returned. But the Federal Reserve's own records, compliance estimates, archival documents, court rulings, tell a second story that runs alongside this one. And what that story shows is this. In 1933, the system worked this way once. It took what was visible. It left what was invisible. It processed what was recorded. It left those who categorized correctly. This was not a one-time exception. It was a 90-year documented pattern. Most Americans in 1933 weren't doing the math. They weren't reading the midnight decree text. They were trying not to lose their jobs, to feed their children. But those who read the text, those who found those 4 words, who understood that the category was more decisive than the location, lived under the same law as everyone else. Same decree, different outcome. What happened between May 1933 and January 1934 is concrete, documented, and 90 years old. This record doesn't tell you what to do. It never did. It only shows what people actually did, when the rules changed overnight, when the bank they trusted didn't return their calls, when the value in their hands eroded by 41% in 275 days. What you do with that record is up to you.